UK police are now receiving more rape reports from 14-year-old girls than from any other demographic. In an interview with the Times newspaper, the Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper, pointed at violent pornography and the lack of action from social media companies to restrict access to it as some of the causes for the rise. So let's speak to Andreas Simon, Director of End Violence Against Women Coalition, which is an organisation which brings together other organisations campaigning to end all forms of violence against women. Let's just start with just repeating that. Police receiving more rape reports from 14-year-old girls than any other demographic. Is that down to pornography?
Yeah, so those high numbers of rapes of girls under 18 are really alarming. We've seen this rise in sexual assault on children by other children as something that the National Police Chiefs Council warned earlier this year was being contributed to by that access to violent pornography and misogynistic content. And what we've long said is that it's been necessary for urgent and much more effective action to address that rampant spread of misogyny online, which is clearly having an impact and shaping young men and boys' attitudes and influencing their behaviour. That violent pornography that often depicts sexual violence is easy to access by young people on smartphones. And it's not just appearing on porn sites, but also on social media platforms. But the issue is bigger than pornography. We also have misogynistic influencers, and they are being facilitated by platforms which spread misinformation and violent content for profit.
So when it comes to regulations of these big tech companies, we hear that often that there's a feeling, there's a sentiment they do not do enough. Is that continuing then?
Yes, I think so. More broadly in society, we then find out that schools have to pick up the pieces of the crisis without the resourcing that they need. So we also want to see the government announcing measures that prioritise relationship and sex education that's relevant to the digital age and young people's lives now. But we have the Online Safety Act. It hasn't gone far enough in our view. We still have multi-billion-dollar companies, don't have enough robust regulation and don't build in enough safety into their platforms by design. And that's actually what we need to be doing if we're going to address this. The law itself still lets down victims. And we think that rather than having some piecemeal bits of legislation which criminalise certain behaviours, what we need to be doing is something more comprehensive in that space where we have an image-based abuse law, and that will ensure that survivors get the access to justice and support they need, and that we hold tech companies to account more strongly. But also it's so vital that when we're thinking about young people, we're not just thinking about the criminal law space, it's about education and letting young people know how best not to experience sexual domestic abuse in their own relationships, and also what to do when they do experience that abuse, that there's safe ways to report and that things can be done to safeguard them.
So just in terms of the UK Home Secretary also pointing to a possible gap within schools and parents, that they have to step up their game and as parents help in covering that gap, that educational gap. Is that something that you would agree with?
I think it's important for all of us to be talking about these issues, but certainly delivering that media literacy education, the relationships and sex education in schools, that does need to be relevant, as I said, to young people in the digital age. It's the best way of trying to prevent more people from experiencing sexual domestic abuse. It creates those spaces where young people can discuss sex, relationships, and in its absence, we do find young people looking online to plug those gaps in sex education, and what they're increasingly finding is more violent pornography, which depicts sexual assault and misogynistic influences, that content which has massive currency and is being promoted by social media platforms and other tech companies which profit from the abuse. So yes, there are lots of gaps that do need to be supported by the government's focus on preventing harm to young people.
And Andrew, just briefly, if you would, arguably young boys, they're not looking out to be violent. Is it just that accessibility that perhaps leads them to then potentially behave that way that ends up that you've got so many young girls reporting rape?
I think the way that algorithms work, we're quite familiar with this idea that you're not always searching for content, but content is being pushed towards you. And I think many young men and boys are in this in a situation where they might be looking for mental health content or other issues, fitness advice, and they are getting pushed a lot of very extreme misogyny. And we haven't found that the law has addressed that yet. We haven't found that the regulator is addressed that yet. So we can't just continue to allow this to grow and be more of an issue and embed itself in society and in culture without addressing the other side of things, the education that young people need to, and the spaces they need to talk about what they are consuming online.
Andrea, thank you very much for your expertise. Difficult subject, but it's good to get attention to it. Andreas Simon from End Violence Against Women Coalition.